time. I actually want to start out with a phrase that, in terms of the wording, just occurred to me this morning. It's sort of like, if I could leave people with just one thought, this would be it. And I'm not going to take time today to elaborate on the idea behind it, but I hope it's meaningful for people. And it's this: if you speak out against corruption, you risk being attacked. If you stay silent, you are sure that we all get attacked. So I want to encourage people to, it's a decision everybody has to make for themselves, but if enough of us don't collectively speak out and call out the corruption, we lose. The vaccine war is not going to be won by a lawsuit or a medical study or a new law somewhere in state and federal government. And we have to fight all of those battles. But the war wins when enough of us join hands and speak out at the same time and say no. And it's not going to end until we do that. And the reason is because the people controlling all of this control the healthcare industry. They control the legal system, and we can get occasional wins here and there. But until we call out the corruption, which will ultimately include corruption in the healthcare industry, in the legal system, and other places where there is widespread corruption, despite good people also being throughout these systems, then it's going to be a very long and painful road for all of us. So take that in whatever way works for you. No judgment there on my part on any given individual. It's all I can do to not quite run my own life. I'm not going to run anybody else's. But keep in mind that what wins the war is when enough of us speak out and say no, in my opinion, for what that's worth. Real quick, the federal government does not have authority to mandate vaccines for state residents. This is why all the daycare, school, and college vaccine requirements and exemptions are in state law. But there are several areas where the federal government does have jurisdiction and does pass laws requiring vaccines and setting out exemptions. And so, for example, anything that involves interstate travel, that's a federal jurisdiction. U.S. airspace, airplanes, airports, federal jurisdiction. Employees throughout the country where the employer has 15 or more employees, governed for purposes of religious objections to vaccines by federal civil rights law. So that's federal law. Military, members, families, civilian contractors, employees with the military, federal law, Department of Defense regulations. Immigration, immigrants, foreign adopted children, refugees, all under the immigration category, federal law. So vaccines are required in many different areas. You listed that off in your very gracious introduction of me. And certainly the largest category deals with school and daycare, and that's all state law, or mostly state law. But, military schools would be federal law, for example, but the vast majority of it is state law. So there definitely are issues, though, in terms of rights and exemptions in state and federal law. And it's important when you're dealing with a vaccine mandate and you want to have an exemption to understand what law applies and what the procedures are, and that you understand and follow that correctly, and that you understand how the law works. It's not about what we think, for example, with religious exemptions. It's not about what we think is a religious belief. When you're talking about a legal right, it's about how does the law define religion for purposes of a vaccine religious exemption. Not a short answer question, but one we should be asking before we go forward, especially if you're in a situation where you have to state the religious beliefs to get the exemption. Now, I want to talk a little bit about places we can file complaints. And I checked let me back up a step. The Federal Department of Health and Human Services, like some other federal agencies, has a division of civil rights. And in January of this year, the HHS Civil Rights Division announced a new division within their Office of Civil Rights called the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division. And there's been a lot of misinformation thrown all over the internet about this division, this new division, and what kind of issues they can deal with. So there are two basic criteria for a complaint to fall within the scope of the kinds of complaints they can address. So first of all, it has to be a complaint against an entity that receives federal funding from the Department of Health and Human Services, and that might include agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services. That's an umbrella agency that has, I don't know, 300 or something other agencies under it. There, in the federal government, there are agencies within agencies within agencies. It's a complex network of different agency systems going on there. But I checked the website again last night. They have a page listing other federal agencies that handle issues that they don't handle. That includes anything having to do with education. So if you have, you feel like your local school has violated your religious freedom, this is not an agency that can help you. They don't deal with education issues. Now, I can't say this absolutely. I can only tell you that their website says, at least generally, they don't deal with education issues. So if you have an education issue, the worst that could happen if you file a complaint is that you get a letter back saying, sorry, we can't help you. So if anybody files a complaint on an education issue and they actually take it, let me know so I can update my understanding. But my understanding from their website, as I checked it just last night, is they don't deal with education issues. There's a Department of Education that deals with education discrimination when it concerns schools that receive federal education funds. But the last time I checked that department, that agency, they did not deal with religious discrimination, which I find concerning. But if I had to make a guess, and it is only a guess, it's probably because they'd be overwhelmed with complaints that they couldn't manage. But anyway, the other thing they don't deal with, this new division, is they don't deal with employment issues. And that's because the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, another federal agency, is already there to deal with employment issues and discrimination in the workplace, including religious discrimination. And I'll talk about that for several minutes in just a little bit. So again, though, if somebody has an employment-related issue and they file a complaint with this new division, the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, and they accept it, then please let me know. I'll update, my thinking accordingly. We're all trying to figure out how this works, including the agency itself. It's a new division, the division itself. It's a new division. So I think they're still trying to figure out what's going on. And last night, I saw a link on the website that said proposed rules. So it looks like they haven't even finalized their own rules yet, unless they haven't updated their website since they finalized the rules. So a lot of this, people on all sides of the issue are trying to figure out how this works. But again, my understanding is they don't deal with any employment issues because there's already another agency that does that, and that's the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Now, there are two issues based on the criteria as I understand it. It has to be an agency or entity that receives funding from the Federal Health and Human Services agency. There are a couple of issues that I think relate to vaccines that do fall under their jurisdiction, and I have complaints out with the agency, with that new division already, testing the theory. Haven't gotten any feedback yet, so we don't know if they're even going to accept it or rule on it, and if so, what their decision is going to be. But one issue would be, for example, doctors in private practice that accept Medicaid and Medicare, because that's going to be funding coming from the Department of Health and Human Services. And the doctor says, oh, we don't treat any children, a pediatrician says, we don't treat any children who aren't vaccinated, whether the unvaccinated status is legal or not. And if the reason the child is unvaccinated is because the parents have religious objections, and if the child is legally unvaccinated, in other words, either not required to get vaccines at all, or if the child is required, the parents have a religious exemption, either way, that arguably is a violation of your religious freedom, and by an entity that receives Health and Human Services funding. So I think that should fall within their jurisdiction. So I'm happy to report, update later when I get information back from that. The other situation involves the states that have religious exemption forms for school. Now, I just said I don't think they handle education issues, and I'm talking about an exemption form now for schools. But the issue with the forms is when the health department, the state health department, creates a form that, in my opinion, violates the constitutional free exercise of religion. So this is not about a school rejecting somebody's request for a religious exemption. This is about a state agency imposing a requirement on its citizens. And it's the kinds of forms where they say, you have to sign this form agreeing that you're putting yourself and everybody else at risk. You terrible, awful person. Just sign here agreeing to be a really bad person and we'll let you have the exemption. And as it concerns the free exercise of religion, because I think this violates the Constitution on at least 3 different grounds, but as it concerns religion, which is what this new division can address, we know from federal legal precedent interpreting and applying the free exercise of religion to religious exemptions that there are only 2 requirements under the U.S. Constitution to qualify for a vaccine religious exemption. And what the states that have those kinds of forms are actually doing is saying, well, we're going to add a 3rd requirement. Now you have to read all of our information about the so-called science. And I think everybody on this call knows that they're asserting false information to promote immunization. They're arguably adding a 3rd requirement. They're modifying the Constitution in effect. And of course, states don't have the authority to overrule or rewrite or add new requirements to the federal Constitution, which is a higher legal authority than state agencies and state law. So this seems like, both of these to me seem like really clear cases where the new division should accept these complaints as falling within their jurisdiction and should rule on them favorably. Now, in theory, only one person should have to file a complaint to get them to look at it, address it, and hopefully rule in a way that we want them to. But I don't see any problem with them getting 5 complaints or 50 complaints or 500 complaints about the same thing, as long as it happens, well, I started to say as long as it happens before we get a ruling back on any of them, but maybe not. So if anybody wants to file a complaint with either of those 2 issues and would like my legal argument to pass along with it, I'm happy to give that to anybody to use for that purpose without charge, and people are welcome to contact me. Contact information is at vaccinerights.com. All right, I'm going to move on here. I want to talk about federal civil rights law, because I believe that's the law all over the country that gives people in the workplace, not just healthcare professionals, but what we've been seeing in the last few years has been predominantly concerning healthcare professionals. But this could be any employee, as I said earlier, where the employer has 15 or more employees, public or private employer. And for our purposes, it's about, this is an anti-discrimination law. There's a list of categories. Religion is only one of a list. And so if you have religious objections to vaccines, and what qualifies legally is a lengthy discussion to answer in full, but in very brief summary. It doesn't matter whether you belong to any organized religion at all. It doesn't matter which one if you do. What matters is that the specific belief or beliefs that you have that are opposed to vaccines meet the legal requirements. And it's important to understand that this is something that, well, I'll put it like this. In my experience, and I've probably worked with 1,000 or more families and individuals over the last 10 to 15 years in all the different exemption categories that were mentioned earlier, helping people put together a legally sound statement of religious beliefs. And what I see the vast majority of time is that people's common sense approach to that task leads them to something that to one degree or another is not consistent with the legal requirements. So again, don't have time here to go into detail about it, but it's not about what we think is a religious belief. It's about how the law defines religion for purposes of this legal right. And what we're really talking about in more precise terms is that our federal constitution and state constitutions around the country protect religious beliefs and practices. And in order to protect religion, the law has to define it in some way. And it doesn't define it in terms of what beliefs are good or bad or right or wrong. the law and the government is not concerned with the right interpretation of any religion. It's only concerned with protecting religious beliefs and practices, but it does that by strict definitions. And if you approach this in your own common sense thinking, and it turns out that what you come up with is not consistent with the law, you may find yourself having your exemption request rejected. And I see this many times. People come to me after their exemption has been rejected, and I say, well, what did you give them? And they show me something that doesn't meet the legal requirements. Now, sometimes we can fix it and sometimes we can't. It just depends on the situation, but very difficult arena here. I wanted to try briefly, the employment arena has many, many different parts and pieces to it. And these are, it's a complicated area. First of all, it's not a vaccine religious exemption law. It's what's called a religious accommodation law. This could apply to anything that is a requirement in your workplace that conflicts with your religious beliefs and practices. So that could be about the way you have to wear your hair, or clothing you have to wear, or you have to pray certain times a day, or you can't work a certain day of the week. Any kind of thing involving a conflict with religion. And if you request a religious exemption, whether or not your employer offers it, if you request it, that triggers their legal obligation to accommodate you. And they have to accommodate you unless they can prove it's going to cause them, and the language in the law is undue hardship. But what that usually means, it's going to cost them a lot of money. And curiously, I've never heard an employer, and I've worked with roughly 500 healthcare workers all over the country, a lot of experience in this area of law over the last probably about 7 years at this point. And I've never seen any employer scream undue hardship about flu shots, but they are screaming undue hardship as it concerns the next layer, so to speak, as they're now going beyond flu shots to implement requirements for the boosters for the childhood vaccines. All right, what are the issues that come up in the workplace? I would say 90 to 95% of my clients' employers do create a policy allowing religious exemptions, but they require clergy support. You got to have a letter from a minister, or they want to call your religious leader and talk to them. That blatant violation. You don't have to be a member of any organized religion at all. You don't even have to believe in a Western theological God. It's really amazing how broad it is as a starting place, but you do have to meet the legal requirements, which have to do with what the law calls having beliefs that are religious in nature. And that goes way beyond most people's common sense thinking about the word religion. But there are also a number of what I call legal pitfalls, things that people who are perfectly intelligent and reasonable and thinking in a very a reasonable common sense way will nevertheless wander into, usually one or more of these legal pitfalls. So if you're in a situation like the employment arena where you have to state your beliefs, I recommend people do your research, and really you should, and I'm sorry that this is by definition a self-serving thing for me to say, but it's because I'm the only attorney in the country that does what I do. But you should consult a knowledgeable attorney so that when you step out there, you have something that's legally sound, because it's really hard to come back later and say, oops, pretend I didn't say that. This is what I meant to say. Once you put it out there, you're pretty much stuck with it most of the time. So consider doing whatever you think you need to do, but I think the safest thing is to consult a knowledgeable attorney so that you can approach this from the start with a legally sound place, because that's going to give you the best chance of succeeding in your goal to get the exemption. Now, one of the other big issues is the face mask policies. They have to provide a reasonable accommodation when you ask for a religious exemption or for religious accommodation having to do with anything that at work that's a conflict with your religious beliefs and practices. Well, in the healthcare world, when you're dealing with a health issue, reasonable means it has to conform to mainstream medical science. And I have a 20-page legal argument explaining why these face mask policies violate federal civil rights law in 6 different ways, but it all boils down to 2 really simple ideas. No-brainer stuff here. Face masks do not filter viruses out of the air. If you've got holes big enough to breathe through, no, you're not going to catch viruses. Take a fishing net down to the beach and try to scoop up sand with it. You'll get a few grains on the net, but you'll miss most of it. And the CDC has admitted this in a formal federal publication called the Federal Register. They say face masks are used when you or the patient have symptoms and you're close to each other, because the face mask block the larger droplet particles from a cough or sneeze, not the smaller particles, not clumps of viruses, not individual viruses, just the larger particles from a cough or sneeze. Face masks are about etiquette, not about stopping the spread of any infections or disease, okay? Nobody wants to be coughed or sneezed on. It's gross. That's all it's about. But even if the face masks did work, even if they did stop the spread of influenza, the vaccines don't work. According to the CDC, over a 14-year period, the average effectiveness of the influenza vaccine was somewhere, I think, around 30%. Don't quote me on that, but the range was from 10 to 60%. And so in the best year, and there's only been one in the last 14, it was 60% effective. That means 40% of the people who got a flu shot got no protection. And there's research right out of the peer-reviewed published medical literature, no partial protection from flu shots. So in the best case scenario, 40%, and usually it's more like 60, 70, 80%, or even 90% of the people who got a flu shot didn't get any protection from their vaccine, and none of them have to wear masks. And meanwhile, there's 1 or 2% of people who have religious and medical exemptions. So federal civil rights law says they have to deal with you individually on a case-by-case basis. Doesn't matter. They can't get away, and they try this, but it doesn't work legally. Oh, well, it's not discrimination because we make the medically exempt people wear masks too. No, that's not how it works. They have to look to you as an individual. You have religious objections to vaccines. Your accommodation has to be reasonable for you. And a non-scientific policy is not reasonable. So the good news is that, to me, that doesn't look complicated at all. Face masks are not scientific. They are therefore used objectively, which is the legal standard. They are there to coerce, to punish people, to maximize the immunization rates. There was there was a Canadian arbitration case in 2015 that came to that exact conclusion. Face masks are coercive and punitive. There's no scientific basis for them, and therefore it's illegal if you have religious objections to the vaccine. That's the good news. The bad news is nobody's cooperating with this. I've only had one hospital that responded to my legal argument and changed their policy. The other hospitals say, we don't care. Nobody's ever argued with me. No one says, here's why we disagree with your legal analysis, Mr. Phillips. No response. And the EEOC, same thing, no response. They don't explain why they don't cooperate, but they don't cooperate. So all I can't say for sure, I can only speculate, but it sure looks to me like there's a lot of politics in this field, and people who are afraid to take on the medical community or whatever. I think I'm probably getting close to the end of my time here. I'll mention that when hospitals create their own forms, all right, you can have a religious exemption, fill out this form. There are lots of issues that come up. Some of the forms look fine in terms of my analysis about the law, but other forms violate the law. When they require you to agree with them, I believe that violates constitutional free speech. When they require you to sign a form talking that you understand all what a terrible decision is for you to get an exemption, you're putting yourself and others at risk. My opinion, that violates the free exercise of religion. There are problems with a lot of the forms. So this can be a difficult arena because people on both sides of the issue, employers and employees, misunderstand the law, and everybody's trying to figure this out as they go. So good idea to do your research in whatever way works best for you to understand how all this works so you can go forward with an exemption in the workplace in a legally sound way that gives you the best chance of succeeding. Other thing that comes up, the badge policies, name badge policies. Everybody who gets their vaccine gets a little sticker on their badge saying, I got my flu shot. Well, that's a HIPAA violation because they're telling everybody that I didn't get a flu shot And I have to wear a face mask. They're telling everybody I didn't get a flu shot, and that's my private medical information. Sorry, folks, not a HIPAA violation, but it is a federal civil rights law violation if you have religious objections to the vaccine. A couple other real quick points. There's a widespread myth that hospitals have to get 90% of their employees vaccinated or they're going to lose Medicaid and Medicare. No. No regulation that says that. That's only a recommendation. For example, from Health and Human Services, Healthy People 2020, they have a recommendation 90% of healthcare workers vaccinated annually with the flu shot by 2020, but only a regulation. The federal government doesn't have authority to mandate vaccines for state residents. And CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, they are a federal agency. They don't have authority to require 90%. What they do require is that hospitals report whatever their level is, but they don't require 90%. And they couldn't, it wouldn't matter, even if they could, it wouldn't matter if you have a legal right to say no, for example, under federal civil rights law, you couldn't be counted as non-vaccinated for that purpose anyway, because it's outside of the hospital's control. So they couldn't be penalized for something that's outside of their control. So there's a lot of misunderstandings here in this arena, a lot of different parts and pieces and complications. And I think I'm probably at about the end of my 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. People are welcome to reach out to me. I spend lots of time answering phone calls and emails that I don't charge anybody anything for. I'm here, of course, to help people individually when they want to hire me and need to hire me to do that. But I do lots of presentations, activism work, interaction with people. It doesn't cost anybody a dime. Everybody is welcome to reach out to me with questions about any of this, and I'm happy to help to the best of my ability. Thank you again very much for allowing me to be part of this today.
Okay, great. I'll assume that you guys want me to talk since you're putting my face on the screen. So my name is Colton Boyes. I'm a lawyer from Idaho. I'm licensed in Washington, Idaho, New Mexico, and the U.S. Federal Court of Claims. The Federal Court of Claims is in Washington, D.C. That's where, under the Tucker Act, you can sue the federal government, generally for violations over $10,000, and also where the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program petitioners go to seek relief. I appreciate Health Freedom Idaho asking Alan Phillips to be here. I've had several conversations with him over the years and have listened to his radio show and followed his work, and just impressed with that man. He's an excellent person. The Health Freedom Idaho ladies, awesome. Thank you for having me. Getting started today, I not intending to give anybody legal advice over the air, just want to have an educational talk with you today, kind of show you how I go through my analysis of things like this, where I start. I'm an avid student of history. I really like promoting local control, local government having the ability to make rules and regulations for their own communities. There's pros and cons there, but I think the pros are so strong, they outweigh the cons, and it gives us an ability to self-govern, which I think is really important. That being said, I don't advocate anyone to get or to not get a vaccine. I think that should be a decision everyone should make with their medical professionals' assistants based on fully informed consent. And I think that's a really important problem that we're facing today, is kind of a gloss over this informed consent idea. And so I've been studying this from a legal perspective for some time now. We're here today because we're discussing healthcare workers' rights regarding, do they need to have a medical procedure performed to retain their job? So I have seen a lot of information regarding this issue online. There's been encouragement to have people file complaints with HHS, the OCR, which is a subdivision there. I'm not going to tell you to file one or not. There's important limitations periods that are generally 180 to 300 days, depending on your cause of action. And so acting promptly is always very, very important if you have an issue here. When it comes to this employment litigation, there's a lot of facts on the front end that make a big difference. Well, I agree. I see there's no statute of limitations on fraud. Sure, in Idaho we have the discovery rule, which means, the statute of limitations doesn't start until you know or should have known. I believe that's an accurate quotation of the law of the existence of the fraud. However, just because I take a position as a lawyer doesn't mean I agree with it philosophically. And so I see a lot of clients make bad legal moves because they're getting advice from people who want to take a really philosophically honest approach to how the world should be. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. However, I've just seen people have really bad outcomes that aren't based on the state of the law. And so at the end of the day, you're going to have a job, you're going to keep it or you're going to lose it. You're going to make a complaint, you're going to win or you're going to lose. You're going to go to court, you're going to win or lose. If you don't pay your taxes, somebody with a gun is going to show up to your front door. Do I agree that's right? No. But do I want you to have to face that outcome? No. And so as a fiduciary for a client, I have to advise them on the practical aspect of what would happen if they take a proposed course of action. And so I will tell you that I haven't seen any complaints be successful in my own personal research through the HHS OCR office. I'm not saying they aren't. I'm just saying I haven't found anything on Pacer online that shows a complaint go in based upon an employee of a hospital not wanting to get a flu shot, and then they take it through the OCR division. The OCR finds some religious discrimination and makes a positive finding for them. However, I see this quite a bit in DOJ, EEOC, and I can walk you guys through how I find this stuff. It's really fun to find it. I'm reading one right now that I pulled offline from the U.S. Department of Justice. They have an employment litigation section that, and this is off their website, enforces against state and local government employers the provisions of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and as amended, this includes discrimination based on religion. And so they have a press release here. So this person was I think a nurse assistant, and this person was employed at a facility called Lasta Care Center, a nursing home rehabilitation facility that was owned and located in a county in Wisconsin. They had a written policy requiring all their employees to receive an annual flu vaccination that it permitted employees to attain a religious exemption from the vaccination requirement and allowed them to wear a protective mask. And Alan spoke about that issue. This is just the facts of the case here. So at least they had the opportunity to wear the mask and not get the vaccine. I consider that better than having to get the vaccine or get fired, but doesn't mean I necessarily agree with that. It also required employees to provide a written statement from clergy, a clergy leader supporting the exemption with a clear reason and explanation. If the employee failed to receive the mandatory shot, receive a medical exemption, they were deemed to have voluntarily resigned, and they were terminated from their employment with the center. So they had until October 24th of the year to get the flu shot, and this happened in September 2016, to give you kind of an idea of how long it takes to make this into the court. This individual met with the campus administrator, explained that she had a religious belief stemming from her interpretation of the Bible. And on my talks with Alan, it's not required that you are a member of any certain type of bona fide religious community, but Alan's really the expert on that. So I'd really encourage you to reach out to him if you have a need for a religious exemption form. He could help you draft that. He's very affordable and he's very passionate about it, and I believe you'd get a successful result. So 24th meeting in October, they said, well, sorry, you don't have an affiliation with the church or organized religion, therefore you're going to fail in this exemption. But she couldn't get a clergy leader to write it. So they told her she'd be terminated if she didn't get the shot, and to consider it your last day. At their meeting, they didn't allow her to provide an alternative letter, but she did want to provide letters from her friends and families. And she wrote them a letter, a to whom it may concern letter, explaining her biblical grounded basis for her religious objection, cited many passages in support, and delivered that along with friends who were personally attesting her religious sincerity. But they threatened her immediate termination despite that. If she didn't take the flu shot, she did. She ended up crying. She alleged she withdrew from work. Her personal life suffered from sleep problems, anxiety, a fear of, quote, going to hell because she had disobeyed the Bible by receiving the shot. And the problems continued to plague her until this day. This was written in March 06 of this year. So the DOJ's position here is that the center could have reasonably accommodated Williams' religious exemption to receive the mandatory flu shot, because they refused to allow her to verify her religious exemption request by using something other than a letter from a clergy member. They found that that was unjustified. And in fact, since Williams filed her charge, the center had changed its policy and no longer required a letter from a clergy leader to obtain a religious exemption to the flu vaccination requirement. And so that brings me to a really important point that I wanted to discuss with the people who are on today, is that not every person needs to file a complaint. A lot of times you can write a letter, an attorney can write a letter and request the hospital to change their policy. I think Alan's had success with that in the past. That's really the easiest way to do it, that could affect a lot of other people as well at the hospital. And so I think it's a misconception to automatically believe that you have this big knockdown, drag-out fight where you have to file a complaint with an agency and go to court. Sure, sometimes that's required, but there's a lot of work Alan and I could do on the front end to maybe get the policy changed, get the hospital to comply with the law, provide them with some of this information, because they want to avoid having to defend a complaint like this. So, to going on to explain this complaint, which was through the EEOC and the DOJ, the DOJ, their position was the center could reasonably accommodate her belief without suffering from an undue burden, giving that its own written policy provided a reasonable accommodation, for example, being permitted to wear a protective mask. Maybe that's not the best outcome, and there could be other constitutional or statutory issues with that, but at least it's a better outcome to not have to take the shot. So I see a comment here from Alan: fraud statute of limitations vary from state to state. Right to hospital administrators often. EEOC complaints can take months or years to play out. So it's important to note also that the center here was a public and non-religious employer. That stuff's important, but it's a public non-religious employer. I think that would probably apply to quite a few healthcare workers out there. And these requirements weren't related to their business purpose or their business operations. And so two claims for relief were made by the DOJ here. One was disparate treatment based on religion. They alleged that by maintaining and enforcing a policy in violation of Section 703A of Title VII that required employees to submit a letter from clergy in order to obtain a religious exemption from its mandatory flu shot, discriminated against adherents of religions which did not have clergy and therefore could not provide a letter from clergy to attain the exemption. They said it was facially discriminatory employment policy that discriminated on the basis of religion and was not justified by a bona fide occupational qualification. The second count was failure to provide a reasonable accommodation of religious practice. This was based on that her religious belief conflicted with the defendant's policy mandating the annual flu vaccination, and that it required a religious exemption to be supported from a clergy letter. So you have a failure to provide a reasonable accommodation and disparate treatment. I've had some experience filing EEOC a complaint, and this is pretty standard stuff there. Disparate treatment, failure to provide reasonable accommodation. So I know I at least have one example here of an actual complaint that's pending in the court. I'm looking at the docket report. The last activity was August 13th, and it was an answer filed by the county. So there will be, probably a motion to dismiss, motion for summary judgment, may end up in a settlement. It's hard to predict how that'll happen, but just want everybody to know that this action is a prosecution by the DOJ that was initiated after an EEOC investigation that was initiated by a nurse assistant. And so there's an amazing amount of things you can do to change the situation for other people there, and they're still litigating this in the courts, but prior to this litigation, the center had already changed its policy. So that's a really interesting fact. I have a couple of other news stories here in my research regarding healthcare workers and this mandatory flu shot, vaccine, medical procedure, whatever you want to call it. I think medical procedures in general, that's the way I think about it. So here's one from the EEOC again, a Tennessee hospital. This was an October 10th press release that alleged Title VII violations as well in the Middle District of Tennessee after first trying to reach a pre-litigation settlement. There was another case I found here, January 12th, 2018, Mission Hospital agrees to pay $89,000 to settle EEOC religious discrimination lawsuit. They refused to accommodate and fired employees who declined flu vaccination based on their religious beliefs. I reviewed this case a few weeks ago, I think. I think I remember them having a September 1 deadline for filing a religious exemption. And then you had a December 1 deadline to have the flu vaccination administered. What the problem here is that the December 1 deadline to actually receive the vaccination had a grace period. So say you didn't make it to work, you could comply a few days later and still not violate the policy. But the September 1st deadline did not have a grace period. And so one of the facts here was that they were discriminating based upon the people who were filing the exemptions compared to the people who were getting the flu shots, because one group had a grace period and the other one didn't. And I think they were holding that was disparate treatment as well. And so all of that being said, Alan and I can teach anybody how to get online and pull these cases up and take a look at them and read them. We love to educate people, and I'd be happy to have a follow-up seminar sponsored by Health Freedom Idaho or anyone else really, and we can get onto Pacer. I could share screenshots, show you guys how to find the actual court documents. We can get onto the Federal Register, and we can look up the rules and regulations and study those. It's actually a lot of fun. I understand if I start getting a barrage of comments where you are laughing at me. There's a couple other things I wanted to share with you guys. They were mentioned in these press releases. There's a series of letters from 2012 written by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as well on Title VII religious discrimination. They're available on EEOC.gov. They're informal discussion letters. One's a March 5th, 2012 letter. One's the December 5th, 2012, July 24th, 2013, and there's another letter from November. And these letters discuss everything we're discussing here directly on point from the viewpoint of EEOC. And there's a whole lot of information out there on these religious concerns and mandatory medical procedures. And so can you discuss the overlap between EEOC and DOJ complaints? I think this was from Alan. Sure. EEOC, here's the way I understand it. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is an administrative agency that handles complaints, and they will review and investigate and help you try and reach a settlement. They don't just handle the disparate treatment and religious accommodation issues. They handle other types of employment discrimination issues as well. So you'll file a complaint. They'll take a look at it. They'll reach out to the employer. They'll have the employer file a response. You may go to mediation, and sometimes they will issue a notice of a right to sue letter. But it's one of the things you have to go through before you go into civil court generally to be able to have a cause of action. So if EEOC finds that there's a practice that they're interested in at the time, or that is a problem that needs to be dealt with based upon, I guess, the agency's position, they look like, they look like the DOJ, being lawyers and like the law enforcement version of the local prosecutor, will go in and handle the legal side on the follow-up. So the DOJ can go in and sue just like a prosecutor would sue, and they can sue on behalf of people that may otherwise not sue. And so I see it quite a bit where the DOJ will step in and sort of bring a complaint of violations of federal law.
Yeah, my understanding of the word conscience is that it is used, it falls, let's say it's a subset for legal purposes of the broader label religion. When most of us think of religion in common sense terms, we think of an organized system of beliefs with a building down the street, people meet weekly or however often, so forth, congregate. And that certainly is part of what the law considers to be religion. But it's really fascinating. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case, in fact, some cases, and let me quote some language out of federal civil rights law, but the language, this is EEOC regulations, but this comes from U.S. Supreme Court cases where the courts, frankly, have struggled over the decades trying to decide what does and doesn't qualify as a religious belief for purposes of whether a belief or a religious practice is protected by the so-called free exercise clause in the First Amendment. In other words, for legal purposes, what is religious freedom? And they have defined this to go well beyond the boundaries of organized or structured religion. But here's how far it goes as a starting place, because the flip side of the coin is that there are a lot of things that specifically do not qualify, and a lot of people shoot themselves in the foot to one degree or another because it's incredibly broad as a starting point. But then people get into these other areas in terms of their beliefs that specifically don't qualify. But here's the language. The language in the regulations talks about not only the obvious, the organized religion system of beliefs that is theistic, in other words, beliefs that include a belief in God, but also, and here's the quote, and this is kind of a long phrase, so just bear with me here, but also non-theistic beliefs that are about right and wrong, moral and ethical beliefs about right and wrong that are sincerely held with the same strength as traditional religious views, and that go to ultimate concerns about life, purpose, and death. So there's sort of three main pieces to that. Moral and ethical beliefs about right and wrong, same strength as traditional religious views, and then go to what the Supreme Court called ultimate concerns. Now, this is just my sort of quick and dirty interpretation of that, but it sounds to me like the court tried to find what is really the essence of what religion on the planet today does. And my sort of quick summary of that is, answers all the questions you can't go look up in a science book. Perhaps the single most profound function or service that religions collectively offer is they answer the questions we don't have answers to anywhere else about these, what the court calls ultimate concerns. So here's a real quick example. There was actually a case where a nurse refused the flu vaccine at work because she was a vegan. Now I'm going to simplify the case in order to make a point of it, because it was the actual case was a little more involved or multifaceted than this. But the hospital said, no, vegan is not a religious belief, and they fired her. And she ends up in court, long story short, and the hospital's attorney files a motion to dismiss the case. Judge, throw the case out. Vegan is not a religious belief. And the court, among other things, looked at the language I just read to you. And this was early in the case. The only question on the table was, does the case go forward, or is it over now and gets thrown out? And looking at that language, the court said, we cannot say categorically that being a vegan can't be a religious belief. And so the case went forward. Now, if you are a vegan because you think it's healthy, and the issue here legally is not whether you're right or wrong. The issue here is, what is the nature of that issue? And the law sees religion and science as mutually exclusive realms. So the last thing you want to do in a statement of religious beliefs is talk about how vaccines are harmful, because that's a medical issue. It's not about whether they are or aren't harmful. It's that's a question, according to the courts and the law anyway, that is going to ultimately be answered in science, and so it's not a protected religious belief. So if you're a vegan because you think it's healthy, I hope you're correct, but that's not going to be a religious, qualify you for a religious exemption. But if you're a vegan because at the end of the day, for you personally, morally or ethically, it is just wrong to prematurely end an animal's life for your personal benefit or for our benefit as a species or culture or society or whatever, that all animals deserve the right to live a full life and die of natural causes of old age. That's not a question that science is going to say is, right or wrong or good or bad. That's a moral or ethical judgment for each one of us to make individually for ourselves. And that could be a protected religious belief. And you could hold that belief even if you were an atheist. And you could have, as an atheist, a protected religious belief. I personally find this fascinating. Atheists, I come from a family of atheists. I don't happen to be one, but I come from a family of them. And atheists are quick to say, well, this is unfair to us. All the people with religious beliefs have, legal rights, but we don't have any. Well, guess what? Even atheists could potentially have a protected religious belief. That's how wide open the starting gate is. Now, as I keep saying, on the flip side, there are all these legal pitfalls. The single biggest one is when people mention vaccine harm. Oh, there's the real reason. So it isn't even about religion at all. And that's the quickest way to lose an exemption in the workplace, is to talk about how harmful vaccines are. It's not because they are or aren't harmful. It's because that's not what the law calls religious in nature. That's medical or scientific in nature, and so doesn't qualify.
Hey, Alan, Jamie asked a question. What components would you say are most important to include or exclude in a religious exemption request for it to be accepted by employers? Now, before you give us your 2 cents on that, you can pull up a document on the EEOC.gov website titled Questions and Answers, Religious Discrimination in the Workplace. They say religious beliefs include theistic beliefs as well as non-theistic moral or ethical beliefs as to what is right and wrong, which are sincerely held with the strength of traditional religious views. Although courts generally resolve doubts about particular beliefs in favor of finding that they are religious, beliefs are not protected merely because they are strongly held. Rather, religion typically concerns ultimate ideas about life, purpose, and death. Social, political, or economic philosophies, as well as mere personal preference, are not religious beliefs protected by Title VII. So they also state later in this guidance document that factors that either alone or in combination might undermine an employee's assertion that he sincerely holds the religious belief at issue include whether the employee has behaved in a manner markedly inconsistent with the professional belief, whether the accommodation sought is a particularly desirable benefit that is likely to be sought for secular reasons, whether the timing of the request renders it suspect. For example, it follows an earlier request by the employee for the same benefit for secular reasons, and whether the employer otherwise has reason to believe the accommodation is not sought for religious reasons, but none of these factors alone are dispositive.
Yeah, that's all completely consistent with my understanding as well. And as lawyers, we know that when we want to look up to see what does or doesn't, or let's say is or isn't consistent with the law, we look to legal precedent to answer that question, at least as one of the primary sources of law to help us fill in the blanks or gaps, so to speak, from, say, a regulation or a statute that says you have this right, but they speak of it in very general terms. And then the question becomes, well, what does or doesn't qualify? And I was kind of smiling at the question. It's an absolutely, perfect question. Nothing wrong with the question, but I was smiling in response to it because ultimately everybody's statement of beliefs or every person or family's statement should be unique. There isn't a packaged answer to the question, how do you write a statement of religious beliefs? What there is a series of state and federal court cases that collectively form a body of legal precedent that give us examples in the real world from actual lawsuits in the past of beliefs that did and didn't qualify. And using those points of reference, and then from my own work in just sort of practical terms, what have I seen over the years working with this hundreds and hundreds of times with people in this long list of different categories, what works in the real world on a more practical level. And so I have found in my work that when I'm working with clients to put together a statement of religious beliefs, that it requires an interactive process. It doesn't boil down to a list of bullet points of, here's how you do it, you're good to go. If it did, I would put that in my ebook or on my website. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't even be an attorney. I'd still be a starving musician instead of a starving attorney. But and I'll be honest, I'm not starving as bad as an attorney, but most of what I do is activism work and administrative work that I don't bill for. And that's probably one of the reasons I'm the only attorney doing what I'm doing. I have no business sense and I'm proud of it. But it's not a short answer question. It's a great question, but it doesn't boil down to sort of like a list of bullet points and here's how you do it and you're good to go, or here's the right thing to say. When I work on this with my clients, I go over the law. Here's how the law works. Here's in brief what the legal precedent says about what does and doesn't qualify legally. But I also go over a list of what I call guidelines, which is a list I've built and modified over many, many years, working, again, with hundreds and hundreds of clients, putting together religious belief statements and things to be aware of, things to do, things to not do, things to factor into what you're doing. And I can't tell my clients what to say. I can't tell you what you believe. But I can help you understand which of your beliefs qualify for the exemption and which ones don't. And I can help my clients present their beliefs in the most effective way so that it's clear and truly does say what you believe. But at the end of the day, only you can decide what you believe. So it really is just a case-by-case situation. And there is some legal precedent that says a copied statement can be considered insincere. And sincerity is one of the legal requirements. So this is a really delicate issue for me, and I'm going to try to be as sensitive and appropriate, but at the same time honest and straightforward as I can be about this. There are a lot of anti-vaccine websites that post sample letters, forms, affidavits, things they've made up. And there are a lot of people who copy stuff and it works for them. Why does it work for them? Well, either the people they're presenting it to don't even have authority to scrutinize your beliefs in the first place. And that's true with most states' religious exemption laws as it concerns school and daycare, for example. But under federal civil rights law in the workplace, they do have authority to scrutinize your beliefs. So you want to make sure, to the best of your ability, that you have something that fully conforms with the legal requirements so they don't reject you on a technicality. But what does that need to be at the end of the day? Well, ideally, it's something unique to each individual. Now, of course, there will be lots of people who share the same religion that talk in similar terms, or, for example, Christians who cite the same Bible passages, that sort of thing. That happens all the time. That's not a problem. But you don't want to copy something word for word from anybody else if the people you're dealing with have the authority to scrutinize your beliefs. And you definitely don't want to copy something off of the internet to do that, because, and I mean no disrespect to these people who put up the websites, they're coming from a good faith, sincere intent to try and help people, and they do help a lot of people. But they don't understand the law, and there are people who have pulled things off the internet and lost exemptions. So you have to be real careful with legal advice from anti-vaccine websites, because I haven't gone out and looked at all of them by any means, but ones I've seen over the years, there's a lot of bad information about legal rights on the internet. So be careful, look for authoritative sources. And yes, that can be an attorney, but you can also go search the statutes and health department regulations yourself. That's all online in every state at this point. You can plug in the words vaccination or immunization and religion and see what comes up. And you can read those laws for yourself. And most of them are written in pretty accessible language, kind of standard basic English where they'll make sense. Some may make more sense than others, but I think for the most part, they're written pretty well for, you don't have to have a law degree to understand, those. And that is a starting place only. There are many sources of law that all taken together tell us what our rights are. And that includes, for example, legal precedent, which is where the courts guide us in how to interpret and apply the statutes and regulations, for example. But very careful, very important to be careful if you have to state your beliefs, that you do something to make sure you have a good understanding about what does and doesn't qualify, so that whatever you end up saying is something that has the law behind it or behind you. I hope I didn't completely dodge the question there.
No, that was great, Alan. Thanks. I have another question for you. Here is a manual, questions and answers, religious discrimination in the workplace. Last time it was modified was January 31, 2011. At the end of the document, it states, what should an applicant or employee do if he believes he has experienced religious discrimination? Employees or job applicants should attempt to address concerns with the alleged offender, and if that does not work, report any unfair or harassing treatment to the company. They should keep records documenting what they experienced or witnessed, as well as other witness names, telephone numbers, and addresses. Employees may file a charge with the EEOC and are legally protected from being punished for reporting or opposing job discrimination or for participating in an EEOC investigation. Charges against private sector, local and state government employers may be filed in person, mail, or telephone by contacting the nearest EEOC office. So does that advice tend to align with your experience regarding helping people prepare their exemptions and what happens after they try and use those?
That sounds great to me. It sounds like a combination of solid common sense and legal thinking there. And it's consistent with what you were saying a few minutes ago, Colton, as well, that while there are formal systems in place, sometimes, in fact, many times, you can resolve conflicts much more quickly, more smoothly, more easily by going through less formal means. And so there's no one size fits all here. Every situation ultimately has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. If somebody is dealing with administrators or supervisors or superiors where it's just clear that it's a brick wall and there's nothing you can do about it, maybe in that situation you jump quicker to an EEOC complaint or DOJ complaint. I just want to mention the availability of the DOJ to address employment and education discrimination is something that's new to me, and I'm going to be diving into that not too soon after this event today, because it looks like there's a wealth of opportunity there for people to get religious discrimination in particular, because a lot of my work is religious exemptions, most of it. The question or the issue about religious exemption is a way to refuse vaccines, but talking about I'm sort of paraphrasing here, talking about the fake science is not. This is a really good point, and I'd be happy to address, and Colton, by all means, jump in as well. But for example, I see it very difficult for employees to ever get a medical exemption. We have a constitutional right to both religious and medical exemptions. The problem with the constitutional right to a medical exemption is that, at least as far as I know, there's no national standard for what qualifies for medical exemption or even who gets to decide. Common sense would dictate that your doctor gets to make that decision for you, but at least currently that's not how it works out. I had one nurse client who had letters from 3 different doctors. She had a lot of different chronic illness issues. She had 3 different doctors writing a letter saying this person should not get a flu shot, and the employer still said, "We don't care, get the flu shot or you're fired." Now, fortunately, she was able to get a religious exemption, so she managed to avoid the flu shot. But that's just bizarre. I see hospitals all over the country in the recent years moving to the CDC recommendation, which is that you have to be dead for a week first to get a medical exemption. And I'm only exaggerating a little bit there. The real criteria is that you have to have a history of anaphylactic shock or Guillain-Barré syndrome within 6 weeks of a vaccine. And of course, you'd have to have that documented, and very few people can meet that criteria. So there's a problem here, I would say, on the legislative level at state and or federal level. We need laws passed that say your private doctor gets to decide whether you qualify for a medical exemption, and then somehow we've got to include protections for the doctor so that they feel safe making that recommendation when they truly believe that. Because many doctors say, I think people qualify, but I'm not going to write the medical exemption, because they're afraid their state medical board is going to come after them. So there's just immense pressure. All of this goes back to sort of a bigger thing I was saying earlier. We all have to stick together and scream at the same time, no, we're not going to play this game anymore. And another facet of that issue is that we have to expose the corruption. The cabal, the controllers, whatever you want to call it, they have a high degree of control over the healthcare system, the legal system. That's how we got in this mess in the first place. So until we expose the corruption in a way that they can no longer hide it, in a way that no longer can people deny it or fail to see it, easier said than done, of course. But when that happens, and one way I think of this is that even a bad person will do the right thing if there's a spotlight on them. So we've got to create that spotlight, that collective spotlight, and then we will better be able to rely on the courts and the healthcare system to do the right thing. But unfortunately, and I have, most of my healthcare worker clients happen to be nurses, although it covers a broad spectrum, doctors, administrators, all through across the spectrum, computer programmers or what have you. Anybody who works for hospitals, and they're expanding beyond the healthcare field now into other fields as well, which of course we all have targets on our back. There's always another person to give a vaccine and always another vaccine to give a person. That's the summary of the pharmaceutical vaccine agenda right there. It's open-ended. It's going to be always growing and expanding unless and until we come together and stop it. But in terms of this question of, can you fight this by addressing the science? Well, not at the hospital level. Of course, ultimately, this is a science issue, and the real science has to drive policy. That's not what's happening right now. Of course, we wouldn't need to be on the call if it was. But it doesn't, that problem is not going to be fixed by nurses doing their research, writing up all the research, taking it to their administrators. There are nurses all over the country doing this. And not only is it falling on deaf ears and not fixing the problem, and the reason it doesn't fix the problem is because science is not what this is all about. That's just a false cover to sell a non-scientific agenda. So we can't fix it by showing them the science. They can't hear it. And the few of them that can hear it, they don't have power to do anything about this. This isn't coming from the hospital level. This is coming from outside of the hospital. This is coming from Department of Health and Human Services. This is coming from the pharmaceutical industry. This is coming from people who have the power to overstep legal boundaries to punish you if they don't like what you're doing. And the dark side of this is the now more than 80 alternative medical doctors, researchers, so-called complementary or alternative healthcare practitioners who have conveniently turned up dead, murdered, or suicided, as they say. This is a really dark, ugly issue, or it certainly has that side to it. And there are criminals who have an enormous stake in this, not just the billions of profit that they make by disabling people and then selling them more pharmaceutical products for the rest of their lives, but staying out of jail if we successfully expose them. So there are really huge stakes here. There's a really dark and ugly side to this, but we're not going to get where we need to go until we expose that. And as I said earlier, if you speak out, you're risking being attacked because they have a lot to hide and a lot to protect. But if you don't speak out, you will get attacked. We all will lose. So we have to come to grips with that, to terms with that. And those of us, whenever we can and however we can, speak out. Because the more of us that speak out together, the safer all of us are, frankly.
So go out there, form legislative study groups, work in with Health Freedom Idaho. Give Alan a call. He loves to strategize. Let's figure out if there's anything you can do to, change the law in your state. Write a statute. Go propose a statute. Get involved. Become an activist. I just want you guys to be encouraged that really every one of you is like 100 or 1,000 of, pick the enemy. Who's your enemy? If you're passionate about something and you do it for free, you're going to be much more effective than somebody who gets paid to do it. So keep that in mind as well when you're spending an hour of time after your full day's work and you're exhausted. That hour of time is very valuable.
I'm so sorry to my health practitioner friends that you are in this position. I beseech you to take a stand. Find other healthcare practitioners that are wanting to take the same stand. Reach out to an attorney. Reach out to Kirk's Law Corner. Find out what your rights are and take a stand, because if you don't, who's next?